Welcome to Wildcard Workshop. Today, we demystify replication. Replication is the process by which your server and your clients communicate with each other. This is how multiplayer games work, basically. In other engines, it might just be referred to as netcode, or they might have some fancy term for it. But ultimately, it's the process by which the server communicates with the clients that are connecting to it. And that's all it is. Okay? It's just the process of passing data from an authority to the clients, or in some cases, from the clients to the authority. Authority being, in most cases, a dedicated server, or a non-dedicated server in some cases as well. I know a lot of people have problems with replication. It is difficult to visualize. So, I have enlisted the help of some very good friends of mine. Right? Meet the Zenettes. These three are going to help me demonstrate replication in the grand view for you, in what it does, how it works, how client and server world representations are actually interacting with each other. So, here's what I want you to visualize. I am a dedicated server. Okay? My three helpful assistants are clients that have connected to me. All four of us have a particular block of code, a graph that is going to run. There is no replication process specified on this graph. It's just going to run on all four of us. But this particular bit of code has a randomized element to it. What I'm going to do is this particular section of code that's going to run is raise your hand and then randomly select a number between 1 and 5 and display it. Like so. Okay? So all four of us are going to run this code. But remember how I said that there was that random property? Well, you're going to see how that affects a situation where replication is not being properly addressed. So, in 3, 2, 1. You see that? All four of us picked a different number. Okay? That's what happens. If you have a particular set of code that's running on the dedicated server and on the clients, and it's important code, it is the code that decides a defining factor of something, then this is what's going to happen. You're going to get a desync, a disconnect between your server and your clients. So how do we solve that problem? How do we get them to interact with each other? Well, we have different types of remote procedural calls, is the proper term for them, or replicated events. Okay? We're going to do this scenario again, but what you're going to see is what happens when we have implemented replication properties. So again, in 3, 2, 1. So now you'll notice I raised my hand first. And then you saw me make the decision. Then the clients raised their hands with the same number already specified. Okay? What I'm trying to signify with this is that the server chose that random number and then sent it off to all the clients. Because here's the thing that you need to understand. Even though all four of these instances are me, they are distinctly separate existences. When you're working with a multiplayer game, you're not dealing with a client that is viewing the server instance of the world. The client has its own completely built instance of the game world. And properties are just being transferred to the client so that the client can replicate, it can recreate the server world locally. And that's the thing that I think most people have the most trouble visualizing, is that we're not actually all playing in the same game world. We're all playing through a proxy world. And then the proxy world is communicating with the server world. And that is how we keep all of the clients in sync. This is what replication is. So now let's go ahead and jump into the dev kit, and I will show you how to actually implement proper replication in your games. Because now I think you've got a good picture of how this actually needs to work. Before we dive into the dev kit, I want to make sure that you're all aware of this document. This particular document covers UE4 in general and replication, as well as some other subjects, but it's an extremely useful piece of information to have in your back pocket. It goes into far more depth than we're going to actually cover in this video. So if things aren't working exactly as how you expect, it might be a good idea to review this document and see if maybe another method might be appropriate for whatever you're trying to do with replication. You'll also find that it covers the framework setup for UE4, how the game mode, game state, player state, pawn, player controller, how those parts all interact with each other and how they're limited in the network scope. I will put the link for this document in the description of the video. I would suggest that everyone bookmarks it and keeps it in their back pocket for when they need it or when they're bored. I mean, the document's pretty dry, but find time to read it. It will help a lot. Here I have set up another actor BP, just a blank one. You can see how to set those up in video number 2. It's not overly complicated. But we're going to start out with variable replication. And this is probably the simplest form of replication to implement, but it's also one of the more limited ones. Let's go ahead and create a variable. We'll just name it the replicated variable. Now, to set this variable up for replication, down here in the Details tab, you will find this replication property with a few options in it. Replicated, rep initial only, or replicated initial only, and rep notify. We'll start with replicated. Replicated makes it, once you've set it that way and you see it on the graph, you'll see these 2 little dots. Those specify that a variable is replicated. And what this means is that the value of it will be automatically transferred from the server to the clients. Remember, from server to clients, not the other way around. Replicated variables will never go from client to server. And that's all you have to do to set up a replicated variable. When you make changes to it, the clients will receive it eventually. It won't necessarily be immediate. Replication happens in periods for variables. You will see in the defaults, there's this replication section. There is a net update frequency and net priority. If you want to know about how these will impact replication, review that document that I mentioned before. For now, I would suggest just leaving them at their default values and experimenting with them after you've set up your logic and decided what you want it to do and how you need it to work. Now, replicated initial only is for when a variable will only replicate the first time that it's set. It'll replicate out to the clients and it'll be good. But after that, if there's a change to it, you'll need to manually replicate that variable, and we'll go into that when we start talking about remote procedural calls. Rep notify is an interesting one. Whenever the value of this variable is changed, or whenever this variable is replicated, you'll notice that it just added this function up here. Whenever that variable is replicated, this function will fire. And then you can put any logic that you need in this function that needs to be run after a variable is replicated. It doesn't happen before, it happens after the replication. And this does happen on both server and client. This will fire. So if you need them to do separate things, this could be a potentially good place to work in. So that was variable replication. Now there's also function replication, but before we get into that, there is one thing I want to mention, because we showed it in previous videos. If we add, say, our event begin play, remember this is an event that is fired, it's engine managed. It fires after the actor has been constructed on both server and client. So oftentimes, when we are working in it, we will use this macro, switch net authority, or switch has authority, but for the most part, these are the same macro. It's just that switch net authority is a slightly more granular in that it gives you a separation between dedicated server and player server, whereas switch net authority, or switch has authority, only does authority and remote. So authority here is both dedicated server and player server on this macro. Dedicated server is exactly what it sounds. It's a dedicated server. There is no actual players that are running on that server. It's just all of the important code that needs to be running for the game. But a player server, or also sometimes called a listening server, is one where it's a player that is the host. This would be the non-dedicated server options in Arc. So I prefer to use switch net authority because it gives a bit more fine control over how we are establishing our networked code, because things that need to run on server and things that need to run on client both need to run on the player server. So if we have a bit of server code up here and we have a bit of client code up here, and normally those do not intermingle at all, they do both need to run on the player server. So you'll have to handle that appropriately. For function replication, or remote procedural calls as they are properly termed, these are events. To make a remote procedural call, you'll come down here, you'll do custom event. You'll name it. I suggest doing either starting it with RPC or with the particular type of RPC it is. For instance, if it's run on server, I tend to start them with ROS, or if it's run on client, I start them with ROC, or if it's a multicasted event, I start them with MC. But this is just a personal standardization that I use. You can use whatever you want to denote them, but I do recommend that you do something to identify these particular events. So let's start with multicasted. To turn this into a multicasted event, which is an event that is called from the server, and then it runs on all of the clients and the server. It runs on everything. To do that, we come down here to where it says replication, and we select multicast. Now you'll notice nothing happened up here. There's a weird quirk with the editor where after you change this, it doesn't update here. Easiest way to fix that, come back up here to the name, just click in the field and then hit enter again and it'll update here. So as you can see now, it says replicated from server, executes on all. What that means is that if I put any code over here, it will run on all of the clients and the server. Now you'll notice there's this reliable checkbox. That does not mean what you think it means. I know we talk about network packets being dropped and things like that. This has nothing to do with that. What reliable has to do with is the order of events. See, when you fire replicated events, the order that they're sent may not necessarily be the order that they're fired on the client. What reliable does is it specifies that, hey, this event it's order dependent. It has to be fired before this next one or before that other one that came before it. That's what the reliable checkmark has to do. So don't turn this on all of your replicated function, on all of your multicast or run on client or whatever events, because it has a maximum buffer. You can overload the reliable event buffer and it can crash your game. It can cause problems. Use this sparingly and only when you need to. So back to this. We've got our multicasted event. Runs on everything. What are the other kinds we have? We have run on server. This one, we'll talk about that in the next part. Excuse me. Run on owning client. Run on owning client is when the server is calling the event on the client that owns the object. Client ownership has to deal with the actor instance, not the blueprint itself, not the class, but the actual instance has a network owner. The network owner, the client that owns that object, is the only one in which this event will be fired. You'll see this primarily with player pawns, buffs, player controllers. These things are owned by a client, but things like primal structures, they are not owned by a client. So this will never actually fire for them unless they are given a client owner, which in some cases might be useful, but it's not something that's set up by default. To set up a client owner for an object, there's a node for it. So we have set owner, and that's exactly what this does. So there's an actor target. So let's say we've got self. Okay, so this instance of this actor BP blueprint and then new owner, it's an actor. So what this will do is whatever you put into here, it'll follow the outer chain of ownership. So it'll see what owns that actor and then what owns that next actor until it finds a client, if it finds one at all. So keep that in mind. This is how you set ownership. You might want to experiment with that, but for the most part, all of the game actors already do have ownership set by default. If you're creating something new for the game, some kind of new type of actor, you may have to manually determine if it needs a client ownership. But this particular type of replicated event will not fire on client instances of this object or actor unless they are owned by a particular client. How do we actually use these events, though, for replication? Well, just like a function or any custom event. When you create them, you will find that there is an input bar down here. You can hit new, set a type for it to be passed, say string, and then once you have done that, you can say hook it up to whatever. Let's actually set this back to multicasted. And then remember, click in that field and just hit enter again so it updates. So now we've set up an event. It has a string parameter that we can use. To actually use it though, we would have to call it. So we can go MC event, like so. And you just call it like any other function. So if we have, for instance, an event begin play, up here, and this gets run. Now remember, this is replicated from server, so even if this is called on a client, it won't actually fire. It'll only fire if it's called from a server. Then we can give it any value for passing in here. Say the server has some variable. We'll just set this up. This is not a replicated variable, for instance. So if we have a non-replicated variable that we want to pass to the clients, we could just do something like that. Obviously, we might want to use a Boolean in this case since it's a Boolean variable, but we've got a print string down here. We could do this however we need it for any given problem that we're trying to solve, but this is how you call a replicated event. This actually sort of looks is if we were to put a switch net authority here. If it's being fired in either of these scenarios, it'll call this on all of the clients and the server or player server. If it's being called on the client though, nothing will happen. This won't be called. It has no authority. It has no right to call this event. So the engine rejects it. That's how you call replicated events. RPCs, remote procedural calls. So this is going from server to client in what we've covered in this section. In the next section, we'll cover going from client to server. Okay. So now you've seen how to communicate from the server to the client. What about the other way around? Well, things get a little bit tricky there because there are some rules that have to be in place, and most of these have to deal with network ownership. Okay? First rule. A replicated variable will not replicate from the client to the server. Ever. Period. Won't happen. Okay? In order to replicate data from the client to the server, a remote procedural call with the run on server flag needs to be called from an object that is owned by the client. That's the catch. Whatever blueprint you are trying to call this run on server event from has to be owned by the client. And we'll get into how to do that when we get back to the dev kit. But for now, let's demonstrate this a little bit. Let's raise the Zenets. Yeah, I went there. Oh, is this guy? All right. So here's the deal. We're going to do our same scenario as last time, where we have one of us is running the code to select a random number. Okay. Now, the client that owns this instance of a blueprint. Okay. We're working in one instance of a blueprint that is being replicated to all of the instances of the world. But the one that has network ownership is this guy right over here. Okay. The other two do not have network ownership over this instance of the object. What we want is we've got a player interaction where the player has chosen a number that needs to be communicated to the server and then back out to all the other clients to see. So here's how it works. In 3, 2, 1. See how that works? The client chose it. The client sent that information to the server, and then the server sent it back out to the other two clients. That's how it works. If you want to communicate with the other clients, you have to go through the server. Easy enough, right? Let's head back over to the dev kit, and I'll show you how to do it. Client server is a little bit different. In order to pass data from the client to the server, it has to go through a replicated function. Replicating a variable, it will never, if you make a change to a variable on the client side, it will never be replicated to the server. This is a security feature of UE4. It prevents people from just editing the values of a variable in memory and having it just go right to the server. It's just not a supported means of replication, and it's a good idea to not have it, to be perfectly honest. It's a terrible way to do things. You have no control, you can't validate that replication. Whereas with function replication, you can. So to create a replicated event that goes from client to server, add a new custom event, and we'll go run on client ROC for short event. We will say, I'm going to give you that Boolean value. So to set it, we want to do run on server. Oh, excuse me, I misnamed that. It is run ROS event for my standardization. So ROS, run on server, replicated from client, executes on server. So for this to be called, it must be called from an instance of the actor that is owned by the client. So if you're playing the game and you try to call this function on another player's character instance, it won't work. If you try to call it on your own character instance, it will fire because your character instance is owned by your client. Same with your player controller or any buffs that are attached to your character. To use this, we have, say, our print string again. Just move that over there for a conversion. And this is intended to be fired on the server. To use it, we would call ROS event, and this would get called on the client. Or if called on player server, it will just continue on. It will fire on the player server if called from the player server. Like I said, anything that runs on the client or on the dedicated server should be called on the player server as well. If this is called from the dedicated server, nothing happens. So that is how you pass data from a client to the server. So right now we're looking at some additional features that were added to ART to aid with replication. These are not part of base UE4, but when we're dealing with modding, we do not have control over how some of the base assets are set up, and we can't change them without overriding. So we have access to these functions and features to compensate for that. The first of which, you'll notice up here, we've got this set node. This is just the standard set for when you drag a variable off of here and you hit set. It does have to be set as a replicated variable though. If you're going to be using this, I recommend just setting it to rep initial only. And the reason for that is because if you set the value of something and you also set multicast here, it'll force it to be multicasted out to the clients. The thing to understand about using this multicast property is that it can only be used from within the instance of a class that owns that variable. So right now we're working inside of the actor BP. But if we, for instance, had another instance of an actor BP here saved as a variable, and we were dragging off of it and setting that variable external to the actual class blueprint from something else externally acting on it, this multicast property will fail. You will get compile errors. It doesn't work. If you need to multicast a property from outside of a given class, you want to use this function. The way this function works is you give it a reference to the object or actor that owns that variable. So in this case, we're just going to use self. Just pretend that this is a reference to another actor. You would do that, and then you would give it the name of the property. In this case, the replicated variable. What this will do is it uses a system of what's called reflection to locate that property, that variable name, and then multicast it out. So this will allow us to multicast properties that we don't necessarily have control over, but that we need to multicast any changes. This, again, only works from server to client, not from client to server. To go from client to server, we have another set of functions. These are a bit more complicated, but these will work for pretty much anything. There are two flavors, one for actors and one for primal items. This does require to be an actor. This does require primal items. You can see from the reference types, primal item reference, actor reference. So the way these work is you give it the reference to your player controller, okay? Basically the reference to, these are called on client, by the way. You have to call these nodes on the client. You give them a reference to your player controller and then a reference to the actor that we are calling this net execute command on. And I'll show you how to use how to implement these. You then give it a command name. The command name is actually arbitrary. You can make it whatever you want. Let's call it just execute event. And you'll notice there's that is reliable again. It's the same thing as with the events. Do not toggle that unless you need it. And you'll see this execute params. So since we're not using standard events, we have a struct here that we can make. And basically these are just some standard parameter options that are given to us. You can use whichever ones you want for this, for whatever you need. Obviously there are some limitations though, so you're going to have to work within those. But that's how you will pass parameters through this system. This is also the same for the item net execute, except in this case you're giving it a reference to the item that you're going to be calling this on. So we have this now, and we're going to say it's being called from the client. How do we implement it though? Because it doesn't happen automatically. In order to actually use it, we do ep server handle net execute command. These parameters tell you what player controller it's from, and what the command name is, and the parameters. To use it, And this is why I said that the command name is arbitrary. Just use a switch on name. And then you can give it your, what did I give it? I gave it execute event. Copy. So we'll go down here to pin names, we'll put it in there, execute event. Now, whenever this function is called by anything, this will fire, but you can put a branch of code here for whenever your particular command that you want to run is set up. So you can have several different blocks of code in here. You can have it call several different, it would be a good idea to actually separate out your separate commands into functions of their own that just get called by this switch. But ultimately this switch is where it's just going to be a branch where it says, okay, fire this event. Or if it's this command name, fire this other event. And you can just add pins for however many events. And then your execute parameters. You break that and, oh look, you passed a string parameter in there. We didn't actually, but let's just go in here and say, okay, we passed a string parameter in there. So now we just make sure to actually use it that way. And again, for items, it's the same deal. Items are treated differently because they're not actors. So they have to be handled. They had to create a separate means of doing this kind of system. But these 4 means that I showed you were specific to Arc. These are not standard UE4 means of replication, but you will find them useful for when you're doing non-standard things with already existing classes and objects and types. I would experiment with them, see how they actually work, but I wanted to make sure that you were aware of them because it's something that hasn't really been discussed heavily, and it is a particularly useful set of features. I recommend using these means of replicating a variable from the server to the client over just setting a variable to straight replicated. It will be more efficient. It's more deliberate and it's less demanding if we do things this way, if we multicast only when we need to. You should now have a very good understanding of replication, I hope. You should be able to implement these concepts in your mods a lot easier now, and your mods should be a lot more performant when working with multiplayer. You should also hopefully end up with fewer bugs and understand how to debug them easier if you do. I'd like to thank my lovely assistants. Whatever. I hope you all have a wonderful time working on your mods, and that you have gained some valuable knowledge here today. Happy modding!